and welcome back to the channel. I'm Steven. I am a scale model toy photographer who is based in Malaysia, and occasionally I also dabble around with street photography and also landscape photography. Now for today's lens review, this is a lens that you might want to consider if you love street photography and you are on a very strict budget. So this one right here, 32mm f2.8 by a Chinese third-party lens brand called TTartisan. Now this lens was released at least 2 years ago by now, I think. Yeah, it was quite a while ago, and I purchased one simply because it was so affordable. Even by today in year 2024, this is still among the cheapest third-party autofocus full-frame lenses available for Nikon Z. And this lens was going for around 800 Chinese yuan or so over in Chinese websites like Taobao, which is the equivalent of around 120, 130 US dollars. So why not? This is almost like a nifty 50 in a way, a disposable lens. If it is not good, you either sell it or you leave it aside. You're not going to waste too much money, right? There are good news and bad news regarding this lens. So firstly, the biggest design issue I have with this lens, I would say this is a negative in my opinion, is this fixed lens hood in front. You can hear the sound, right? Yeah, you just slide it forward. But from my experience of using this lens, which I wouldn't say is very extensive, I've had this lens for a little bit over a year, but I have taken less than 2,000 pictures with this lens. Yeah. And based on that short amount of experience I have, 2,000 pictures, this is more of form over function. It looks nice. It looks retro in a way, the design language over here. But it feels like there are no differences in the amount of flare I'm getting in my photographs, regardless of whether the hood is being slid forward or not. So think of this as a lens that comes with no lens hood and no option to put one at all, which really sucks because this lens, when it comes to image quality department, which we'll get into that later on, flare is one of the main big weaknesses of this lens, but we'll go into the details later. Okay, back to the design of this lens. So we only get one single function ring, which is, manual focus by default. No switches on the side of the lens. On the back of the lens, we have a metal mount, which is nice to see on a low-budget lens. In fact, there are no Chinese lens brands out there who use plastic mounts, no matter how cheap their lenses are, which is interesting. Canon and Nikon, they try their best to cut costs, to maximize profit margin. Their cheaper lenses have plastic mounts, but in my personal opinion, I don't care that much. Yes, plastic makes the lens feel cheap. It feels low quality, but the key word here is it feels. That is just your perception. As long the optics inside is good, I don't care whether the outer of the lens is plastic or metal or not. That is what I think. Yeah, no weather sealing, of course, to be expected, but we have a micro USB port for firmware updates. Micro USB. What year it is? 2024. Before making this video, of course, I have watched a number of other reviewers by other YouTubers as well, and a lot of them got one single thing wrong with this lens, is that they said that there are no ways of putting filters on this lens, which is inaccurate. This lens does have a filter thread. It is only 27mm. Surrounding these front elements over here, there are actually threads where you can screw on 27mm only. And even on the box of the lens over here, it is written here, filter size 27mm. So how the other reviewers miss out on this, I'm not too sure. Maybe because this is a very unusual design. So this is one of the weakest parts of this lens when it comes to ergonomics in a way, because it is extremely difficult to screw a lens filter on this thing, simply because of the way the hood is being designed. Yeah, it is just a bad design decision in my opinion. Form over function. Okay, so enough about the lens. I think this is under 200 grams. I did not even weigh it, but according to the info on the box over here, this is 196 grams, and that is for the Nikon Z mount version. Moving on to the even more important part about any camera lens, the image quality, the optics, the autofocus and everything else. So what surprised me about this lens in a very good way is the autofocus. Relatively silent. In fact, if you compare this lens to a number of Canon RF autofocus lenses, the T5 f2 macro by Canon or the 85 f2, those lenses are really loud. And this is much more quieter than those Canon lenses that cost like $450 or $500 US. I was impressed for this reason. Yeah, relatively silent autofocus. So this lens is very usable for video if I have to be honest. Speaking of the image rendering of this lens, I think it almost matches my expectations given the price point and given what I know about TTartisan and their manual lenses before they started making autofocus stuff. It feels like using a vintage lens from the 1960s, 1970s and so on, 40 years ago. A lot of flare, low contrast, and not very sharp until you stop down the lens. So at f2.8, not to say the lens isn't sharp enough. I mean, for day-to-day usage, if you are taking photos and downsizing them for social media, even the cheapest, lowest budget lenses are perfectly usable. And this is one of those lenses, right? You insist on buying a full frame camera, but your budget is a bit tight. You want to start with something simple and cheap first, then this is something for you. Yeah, at f2.8, the center and middle third of the image, it looks okay. It is not like tech sharp. Contrast is a bit low, but that is something you can always enhance in editing, not a big deal breaker. And I am not too surprised by the low contrast rendering of the image simply because Chinese brands so far, with the exception of Viltrox and Yongnuo, Chinese lenses, TTartisans, 7artisans, and Maker as well, and a few others, they are not known for advanced lens coatings. In fact, I believe that based on the way this lens renders images, there are probably no coatings to reduce chromatic aberration, color fringing, and also to improve contrast, which is why this lens flares so badly. And yeah, you can see it in this video over here. This is a video, not a photo. And you can see, yeah, it flares up very easily. But sometimes the way the lens flares, it can look a bit artistic. You just need to know how to use lens flares. I am not an anti-lens flare person. There are occasions where I find it very useful in a creative sense, but for this specific lens, I can't help but have to complain about the flare performance simply because it feels like there is a bit too much of it. I also have the TTartisan 11mm 2.8 fisheye lens, a manual lens, and despite being a fisheye ultra-wide lens, that lens does not flare as much as this 32mm lens. I have to wonder, maybe this is intentional by design. Yeah, they wanted this vintage looking image rendering, this lens over here, so they designed it this way on purpose. I can't say I like it a lot, but it is what it is. My biggest complaint actually with this lens, besides flare, is actually the minimum focusing distance. Like, you know, so I was trying to take a photograph of this object or this cat, and then yeah, after I took a photograph, I noticed that it is out of focus, and then I realized that no, I am too close to the subject. I need to move back further. So the minimum focusing distance on this lens is 50 centimeters. For a 32mm lens, that is like 0.1x magnification or less than that. That is horrible. And for some reason, 95-98% of Chinese lenses have horrible minimum focusing distances for reasons I don't know why, other than my own speculation over here. That is how they cut cost and allowed the lens to be priced so cheaply. I can't even use this lens to photograph what I specialize in, which is toy photography, scale model photography. Yeah, the stuff you see behind me on display. This lens is not usable. If you are a toy photographer, you follow this channel because you like toy photography, scale model photography, please do not buy this lens for photographing your toys, your figurines. It will not work. Even if you plan to use this lens on only APS-C, which is equivalent to about 48 millimeters, yeah, you can get a bit closer because 1.5 times crop, but still not ideal. Chromatic aberration, color fringing, of course there is going to be some of them. I wouldn't expect it to be absent in a low cost lens like this, and as usual, to stop it down, it will reduce, but it never really truly goes away. So you need to do something about it in editing later on. My conclusion for this lens over here is that you can buy it. I can recommend it if you plan to use it for street photography. 32mm is weird. I have to admit that. It feels weird when I was using it, and then I slowly got used to it. It feels like a 35mm rather than a 28mm, you know. It is closer to a 35. So that is fine. Just that you need to know its limitations on what it can and cannot do. Don't buy this for close-up photography, for toy photography. And you will be fine as long as you manage to control how and where you shoot to minimize the amount of flare. And until then, I'll see you guys again soon. Please do check out my other lens reviews or other photography tutorials available on this channel. And subscribe. Support this channel. Help it grow. Goodbye.